You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
One summer afternoon in 2016, a young woman squeezed into the tiny bathroom on board a fishing vessel. She locked the door behind her and leaned in close to the mirror to get a good look at her face, in particular her left eye, which was disturbingly red. She used both hands to stretch the skin back around her eye, and the tissue along the edge of her eyelid looked totally strange. So she just ran a finger along it, and then suddenly something dislodged from her eye. It was this small sliver of fuzz, about the size and thickness of a carpet fiber. The woman leaned in closer to the mirror and delicately pinched this weird strand and pulled it away from her eye. She held it up to the bathroom light, trying to figure out what it was, and to her surprise, it was almost half an inch long. As she stood there wondering how on earth this weird piece of fiber had gotten wedged in her eye, something strange happened. The little strand began to move. 26-year-old Abby Beckley perched high in her saddle and spurred her horse into a gallop. She savored the feeling of the wind on her cheeks as she galloped across the pasture towards the stable. Abby had spent the first half of the summer of 2016 renting a room at a converted cattle ranch in Gold Beach, Oregon. She spent her days riding horses and exploring the coast. It was only a half-hour north from where she grew up, so it was a familiar landscape. But being out in nature never got old to Abby. She tried to spend the majority of every summer outside soaking up the sunshine. This August afternoon was her last day at the cattle ranch. She was ready for a new adventure, and tomorrow she was traveling to Alaska to work as a deckhand on a commercial salmon fishing boat. She'd never been out to sea longer than a few days, but Abby was always game to expand her horizons and try new things. Abby pulled on the reins for the horse to stop, then she dismounted and walked the horse into the stable. Once it was in its stall, Abby latched the gate and then walked down the row of other stalls, saying her goodbyes to the other horses. At the end of the aisle was the ranch's one remaining cow, munching hay all alone. Abby gave the cow a little rub on her nose, then she closed the stable door and headed off for her next adventure in Alaska. The next day, Abby took 2 planes and a taxi before arriving in the small town of Craig, Alaska, where her boat was docked. As she walked down the street, she could tell she'd entered a whole new world. The woods on the mountainside were thick and unbroken. The peaks rising above her were snow-capped, even in summer, and the air was crisp in a way she'd never felt before. Abby headed down to the waterfront and saw her boat docked in the harbor. Her first thought was that it looked smaller than it did in the pictures she'd seen. But the crew members who greeted her were warm and welcoming, and one of them led Abby to her bunk and helped her get settled. She was happy to be there and excited for what lay ahead. The next morning, the whole crew had arrived, and once supplies were loaded, the fishing vessel pulled away from shore and headed across the bay towards the open ocean. Right away, it was time for Abby to get to work. She was paired with another young woman named Allison, who was a regular crew member who showed Abby how to work with the other deckhands to cast out the big weighted nets called seines. It was a tricky process. Abby had to help fling the enormous net into the waves with one hand while gripping a rope to drag it back in with the other hand. Also, the net tangled very easily and was surprisingly heavy once it got wet. Abby's first morning was exhausting. Waves kept splashing up on the deck, soaking her and making her shake with cold. Even though it was summer, the wind that whipped across the water had a bite to it. Over the next few days, Abby's mentor, Allison, taught her everything she could about working on a commercial fishing boat. Allison showed Abby how to sort the fish by weight, how to stack them neatly in coolers of ice for sale back on the mainland, how to swab the deck, how to clean the knives and hooks and nets, which were always getting soaked in fish blood and bait. And so Abby came to learn that life at sea was both messy and dangerous. But it was worth it. On Abby's first Friday night on the boat, the crew grilled a festive dinner on the deck and watched the sunset together. At that moment, Abby realized that there was nowhere else in the world she'd rather be. This was awesome. After dinner, Abby helped clean up in the kitchen, and then she flopped down on her bunk. Abby listened to the sound of the waves outside and started to nod off, but she was distracted by an odd itch in her left eye. She wondered if it was a grain of sand, or maybe a fragment of barnacle from the nets. So she rolled out of bed, went down the hall to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. Abby tried to blink to kind of clean her left eye. Then she patted her face dry and went back to her bunk. She needed to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be another very long day of work. The next morning, Abby's left eye was still bothering her, only now she had a headache too. She went back to the bathroom and looked at her eye again, and now she could see it was red and inflamed. Abby decided she would just ignore it for now and get on with her chores. There were fish to be caught. 5 days later, Abby stood on the deck trying to work through her discomfort. She still wasn't feeling any better. Her headaches had grown from mild to full-blown migraines. And even worse, her left eyelid was now starting to droop, which made it hard for her to open her eye all the way. At breakfast that morning, Abby's mentor, Allison, asked her if she was okay, and Abby said that she was uncomfortable, but what was going on with her was probably just a stubborn case of pink eye. Fortunately, their boat was scheduled to return to the town of Craig that afternoon for a short stay to offload fish, restock supplies, and give the crew some time off. Abby decided that it was time to face the facts here, that whatever was going on with her eye and her headache was likely not going to go away on its own. She needed medical intervention. So once the boat pulled into the harbor, Abby helped tie it to the pier. Most of the crew went into town to buy supplies, do laundry, and enjoy a day on land, but Abby went back onto the boat and down the hall to the bathroom. Her eye was really hurting at this point, and so she wanted to look one more time before she went on land to go find a doctor. Abby went into the bathroom, locked the door behind her, took a deep breath, and then faced herself in the mirror. And when she saw her eye, she could tell it was in really bad shape. She couldn't imagine how she looked to her crewmates. Abby ran her finger along her eyelid to see if maybe she could find some foreign object in her eye that was causing so much irritation. And then a moment later, as she was kind of rubbing her finger around her eye, she actually felt something that was kind of small and thin, and she managed to pull it out of her eye. And when she did, Abby immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Now that she'd found whatever foreign object was in her eye, she thought maybe she would start to feel better. But when she got a good look at this thing she had pulled from her eye, she screamed. Pinched between her fingers, writhing around, was a half-inch long worm. Her first instinct was to throw it in the toilet. Her second was to throw up. Instead, she ran down the hall to Allison's door, barged inside, and showed her this worm she had pulled from her eye. Allison's jaw dropped. She told Abby that she'd worked on a lot of boats over the years and seen some strange things, but nothing like this. Allison asked if Abby had handled any infected-looking fish while cleaning the nets. Maybe this worm was actually some sort of maggot. But just the idea of finding fly larvae in her eye made Abby immediately sick to her stomach. And so she threw this little worm into Allison's trash can, then she sat on her bed and tried not to hyperventilate. Allison flipped open her computer and Googled salmon worms. Abby looked over her shoulder as they scanned the results. They existed, but there was no mention of them in connection with humans. Allison told Abby she really had to go see a doctor. The boat wasn't going back out to sea for 24 hours, so Abby had time. Hopefully there was some kind of medication they could give her. Abby went to the ship's galley where they kept a folder of emergency contacts and found the number of an urgent care clinic in town. Abby called, explained her situation, and then booked their next available appointment, which was early the next morning. Then Abby went back to her bunk and did her best not to totally freak out about the situation she was in. However, every time she began to doze off, something would wiggle around inside of her eye, and she'd bolt awake with her heart thumping. The next morning, Abby sat in the small clinic waiting area, tapping her feet nervously. She had arrived early after a terrible night's sleep. Her left eye was totally bloodshot and swollen, and her eyelid was drooping worse than ever. A few minutes later, the doctor called Abby into a treatment room, and right away, Abby told the doctor all about her horrifying symptoms over the past 5 days. The doctor nodded, but admitted he had not seen a case like hers before. The clinic had treated plenty of sailors and fishermen over the years who'd caught odd parasites out at sea, usually from handling old fish carcasses, but those typically affected the intestines, not the eyes. Abby was confused by this. How was it possible that she'd caught something that a local doctor in this area had never treated before? What had Abby done that was so different from the other fishermen? The doctor then had Abby lean back in a reclining chair and swiveled a bright light above her head. Abby squinted while the doctor held her left eye open and gently traced along its edge with a small tool. Then suddenly the doctor froze. Abby tensed as the doctor switched instruments, picking up a small set of tweezers, and then he leaned closer. Abby felt the doctor pluck something from her eye, and then slowly the doctor lifted it towards the light. It was another worm. This one was almost the size of a paperclip. When Abby saw it, she dug her nails into the armrests, totally repulsed. How many of these worms were in her eye? Abby moved to sit up, but the doctor held her down. They were not done. Minutes later, he'd rooted out another worm hiding beneath her eyelid. Abby's mind raced. Where had these worms come from? But even more importantly, why didn't the doctor know what they were or what they were capable of? What if some of these worms had burrowed deeper in towards her brain? Who knew what kind of damage they could cause? The doctor eventually slid his chair back, peeled off his gloves, and sighed deeply. He admitted Abby's situation seemed very serious, but he didn't have the equipment to determine what these creatures were or how to get rid of all of them. Abby's best bet was to fly home and see an eye specialist as soon as possible. Abby agreed, then she stood up, thanked the doctor, and headed back outside. She walked along the sleepy small-town streets in a blur, thinking through every worst-case scenario, from blindness to brain damage to death. She felt invaded, overwhelmed, and totally alone. Abby walked back to the dock and apologized to the captain, but she said she had to go home right now. Then she packed her things and booked the next flight to Oregon. The next afternoon, Abby landed in Portland, Oregon. She walked off the plane and took a taxi straight to the ophthalmology department of Oregon Health and Science University. Her stomach churned with worry, but it felt good to be back in her home state. Abby speed-walked into the huge modern medical complex, signed in, and then asked the nurse to please hurry. She checked her eye with her phone's camera. It was still totally blood red, very puffy, and her upper eyelid was drooping so much, Abby wondered how much longer she'd even be able to open her eye at all. Minutes later, the nurse called her name and took her back to a room where several eye specialists were waiting. Once Abby was in there, she explained each stage of what had happened to her. Her weeks on the boat, the worsening inflammation, all the worms she'd removed. They listened and nodded, while one of them jotted notes. When Abby finished, one of the doctors leaned forward and told her that he had some good news. This was likely nothing. He said that patients often come in thinking they have some sort of parasite or weird insect in their eye, but it was usually just mucus. Abby felt her blood rising. The doctor in Alaska did not pull mucus out of her eye. They were definitely worms. He had even sent them to a lab for analysis. The doctors in the room told Abby to lie back on an operating table. One of them pulled up a chair, clicked on a pen light, and shone it into her left eyeball. Abby steadied her breathing while he inspected her eye. A few minutes later, he clicked the light off and slid the chair back. There was nothing there. He suggested she must have interacted with something on the boat and then maybe touched her eye, but whatever worms she'd contracted were gone now. Abby pleaded with them to please wait a bit and try again. She'd gone to bed last night feeling worms moving around in her eye, so she knew they were still there. And so the doctors exchanged doubtful looks, but agreed to let Abby linger a bit longer since she'd come all the way from Alaska. They all got up and left Abby alone in the examining room. Abby sat there staring up at the ceiling, feeling more and more impatient. For once, she actually wanted the worms to be there. Finally, about half an hour later, she felt one squiggle under her eyelid. She shouted for the doctors who were out in the hallway. They dashed inside, peeled back her left eyelid, leaned in close, searching with the light, and then one of the doctors let out a startled shriek. Abby almost laughed. It obviously was not a good sign for experienced medical professionals to react this way, but at least they were seeing what she was seeing. The doctor removed the worm they just saw and placed it in a sterilized container for testing, and then continued examining Abby's left eye. Within minutes, they'd found another 2 worms. The doctors were buzzing. None of them had ever seen anything like this. They asked Abby loads of questions, but Abby mostly had questions of her own for them. Where had she caught these worms, and how could there be so many? Were they breeding and reproducing in her eye? How dangerous were they? And what if this was just the start of something much, much worse? But the doctors were almost as baffled as Abby, and they couldn't really answer her questions, leaving her feeling scared and frustrated. When the appointment was over, Abby left the building and sat in a patch of grass out front. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on the warmth of the sun, but she could still feel the worms moving beneath her eyelid. The following week, one of the world's leading parasite experts, Dr. Richard Bradbury, strode to the front desk of the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. The receptionist handed Dr. Bradbury a package marked urgent. Back in his office, he opened up the package and spread the contents across his desk. There was a container with worms preserved in formaldehyde, along with a case report from a pathology clinic on the other side of the country. Parasites were his specialty, so Dr. Bradbury was used to being sent worms and other weird creatures in the mail. But right away, Dr. Bradbury could tell this was an unusual case. These were worms pulled from someone's eye. Dr. Bradbury knew of only one species that fit this description, a rare parasite known as the California eyeworm. It usually only infected smaller mammals like dogs, cats, or sheep, but every once in a while, it found its way into humans. This was worrying. In smaller mammals, the worm's impact was sometimes mild, but occasionally, the worms would lead to cysts or even blindness. But in a human, the potential harm from these worms was mostly unknown. Dr. Bradbury realized Abby might be in serious danger. He also worried that the condition might be contagious. Was it possible she had spread the worms to other people? If so, he needed to act fast. Dr. Bradbury lifted his pen to fill out the case file and write down that he believed it was a California eyeworm, but he hesitated. Alaska was a long way from California, and the California eyeworm really didn't infect humans most of the time. And so the doctor had this nagging feeling that maybe something different had invaded Abby's eye. Dr. Bradbury took the worm sample and crossed the campus to the laboratory. Using a small set of tongs, he placed one of the worms between 2 small squares of glass and then slid that under a microscope. Zooming in, he immediately saw that this was not a California eyeworm. This worm's mouth and genitalia were a different shape, and other body parts were in the wrong places. The longer Dr. Bradbury studied this worm, the more certain he became that this was something he'd never actually encountered before. Which left him wondering, what was this? He was a parasite specialist with decades of experience. If he couldn't identify it, who could? Dr. Bradbury consulted the CDC's massive reference collection, which included hundreds of obscure parasites from all around the world. Thumbing through one catalog after another, none of the worms on file matched the one he'd just seen at the lab. It was time-consuming, tedious work, but Dr. Bradbury had built his career on this kind of attention to detail. Going chronologically, Dr. Bradbury dug past the 50s, the 40s, and into the 30s, sifting through every documented parasite the CDC had in its files. His eyes were starting to glaze over when suddenly he stopped. His eyes froze on an unusual scientific drawing. It was dated 1928, and the accompanying text was in German, but the image looked remarkably similar to the sample he had seen under the microscope. The worm in the drawing was absolutely the same as the one from Abby Beckley's eye. But this worm had never been found in a human before, because it was a worm found only in cattle. It was called Thalassia gullosa. These worms live an extremely strange life. They live, mate, and procreate on the surface of a cow's eye. When they produce baby worms, the cow's eye oozes pus to protect itself. Then the flies that kind of hang around the cow step in the pus and drink up some of the baby worms. The baby worms then grow inside the fly until they get too big, and the fly vomits them out, usually into the eye of a different cow. That's how the disease spreads. But in Abby's case, a fly threw up baby worms into her left eye, and they had been living and growing there ever since. The next day, Abby sat in her apartment listening as the doctor from Oregon Health and Science University explained her diagnosis. She slumped back into her couch, totally repulsed. She was relieved they'd finally solved the mystery, but this was so gross. She thought back to the single cow that was on her summer ranch. Abby had often noticed how flies were always swarming all over the cow's eyeballs, but the cow didn't seem to mind or do anything about them. Abby would never think of that lonely old cow the same way again. Abby asked the doctor what the next step was, and the doctor said they had discussed the situation and had actually decided against sending her medicine. Anti-parasitic treatments would definitely kill these worms, but a dead worm might get stuck in Abby's eye and cause permanent scarring. The safest treatment was for Abby to remove the worms herself, one by one, for as long as it took. Abby groaned. This was not the happy ending she'd been hoping for. But she did it. Every time Abby felt a squirming feeling in her eye, she went to the mirror, leaned in, and then pulled the slimy little creature out of her eye with her fingers. Over the next couple of weeks, Abby would remove 8 more worms from her eye, and at that point it seemed like there were none left. In time, Abby would make a full recovery and she would enroll in college to study psychology. However, no matter who she meets, she rarely tells them that one of her claims to fame is being only the 11th person in North American history to be infected by these eyeworms.
Just before 11 p.m. at night on May 20th, 1967, a 50-year-old man named Stefan McCulloch staggered into the Misericordia Hospital in Winnipeg, Canada. Stefan was so physically weak that his oldest son, Mark, was there with him, physically holding him up, carrying him into the hospital. When the nurses at the front desk saw the pair walk in, they immediately got up and walked around their desk over to these two guys and said, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong with him?" And so Stefan, at this point, is so uncomfortable he can barely talk, but he takes a deep breath and then he tells the nurses that earlier that day he had been burned on his chest and stomach, and now he had this blinding headache and he was so nauseous and he could barely walk. The nurses knew clearly this is an emergency, and so they quickly ushered the pair down the hall to an exam room, and then a couple of minutes later, doctors came into the room and they asked Stefan to show them his burns. Stefan, who was already lying on his back on the exam table, slowly reaches down and grabs the bottom of his shirt, and he lifts it up, and the doctors are stunned at what they see on his stomach. There was a very strange burn pattern that none of them had seen before. And so the doctors, they move in to get a better look at his injury, and as they're staring at it, they ask Stefan to explain how he got this burn. Now, what the doctors didn't realize is that Stefan was very conflicted. He knew if he told the truth about how he got this burn, then he would open himself and his family up to ridicule and skepticism. But as he's laying there and the doctors are waiting for his answer, he finally decides that the right thing to do here is just tell the truth. And so he takes a deep breath and then tells the doctors what happened to him. And by the time he was finished telling this story of what happened to his stomach, the doctors had stopped looking at his injury and instead were just standing in the middle of the room staring at Stefan with eyes wide and their mouths open. They were all literally speechless. Within 24 hours, Stefan's story had made news all over the world, and his story had attracted the attention of numerous US and Canadian secretive government agencies who were keen to interview Stefan one-on-one to really find out what he knew. In short, what Stefan claimed happened to him, dubbed the Falcon Lake incident, was a very big deal. However, the farther this story went and the more people that heard it, the more people started to question the validity of this story. It just seemed too unbelievable. that maybe Stefan is just lying or this is a hoax. And so before I tell you Stefan's actual account of what happened at Falcon Lake, I'm going to give you a little context about who Stefan was prior to the incident. Because ultimately, Stefan's credibility in your eyes will determine if you really believe what happened to him. Stefan was born in the early 20th century in Poland, and when World War II broke out, he was captured by the Nazis and put into one of their concentration camps. It was called the Gross-Rosen camp, and it was located in Poland. During his time at that camp, Stefan would bear witness to the Nazis perpetrating some of the worst atrocities ever committed against humanity. In total, approximately 125,000 people were held prisoner at the Gross-Rosen camp, including Stefan. And of those 125,000, 40,000 of them would be killed primarily on site at the camp or on a Nazi-led death march. After the camp was finally liberated in early 1945, Stefan worked as a translator for the US Army, helping them continue to liberate other concentration camps across Europe. But by 1946, Stefan was ready to leave Europe and start a new life somewhere else and put World War II behind him. And so he and his wife, who also was held in a concentration camp during World War II, fled Poland with their 3 young kids and resettled in Winnipeg, Canada. And for the next 20 years, the McCullochs lived a very peaceful life. Stefan would find work as a mechanic at a cement factory, and his wife and his kids would make many friends and fall in love with the Winnipeg community. However, the McCullochs' life would take a sudden turn for the worst on May 20th, 1967. That was the day of the Falcon Lake incident. Stefan was a very passionate amateur prospector. A prospector is someone who searches the earth for mineral deposits, usually gold or silver. Stefan would spend much of his off time traveling all over Canada to different wilderness areas to basically hike around the forest and up over the mountains, stopping to hack into the earth with his pickaxe in hope of discovering treasures underneath the surface. Now, Stefan almost never found any treasures on any of his prospecting journeys, but he wasn't really in prospecting for the riches. Stefan just loved being outdoors and being in nature. It was very calming and peaceful for him, and considering how traumatic his earlier life had been, being in the concentration camp during World War II, finding moments of peace in his life was very important to him. And so, in May of 1967, Stefan decided to go out on another one of his prospecting trips, this time to an area called Falcon Lake. Falcon Lake is a fairly large lake located about 100 miles to the east of Winnipeg. And surrounding this lake was a big forest that Stefan had heard contained silver deposits tucked away in the hillsides. And so on Friday, May 19th, Stefan was ready to go on this trip. And so he packed up all of his prospecting equipment. He said goodbye to his wife and his kids. And then he left the house and made his way to the bus stop where he hopped on a Greyhound bus. 2 hours later, he got off the bus at the stop closest to Falcon Lake, and from there, he made his way to this cheap motel that was right on the side of the highway. He got a room, he got a quick bite to eat in their cafe, and then returned to his room and went to bed. The next morning, May 20th, 1967, so the day of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan woke up early, right around 5 a.m. And by 5:30 a.m., he had all of his equipment either in his backpack or on his belt, and he was making his way out of the motel's front doors. Right outside of this motel was the highway that ran left to right, and on the other side of that highway was this huge forest that Falcon Lake was deep inside of. And so after Stefan left the motel, he crossed over that highway and began walking into the woods. And for the next several hours, Stefan just kind of meandered his way through the woods. He wasn't on a trail. He was just using his compass to make sure he was generally walking in the direction of Falcon Lake. At around 9 a.m., so he's been hiking now for several hours, he looked up ahead and he saw there was a clearing on the side of this hill. And so Stefan walked into this clearing, and 2 things became immediately apparent. One, he was right near Falcon Lake. From his perspective on this clearing, he could look down just a couple of hundred feet, and there was the lake. And 2, the reason this clearing existed and why no trees were growing on it at all is because under his feet was just a huge rock face, like a quartz vein that was running across this hillside. And so this was like the perfect place for Stefan to begin prospecting. And so he set his things down, he got out his pickaxe, he got his welding gloves on, he put on his welding goggles as well. They protected his eyes from any rocks that were flying as he was hacking into the ground. And then he got to work. For the next couple of hours, Stefan very diligently hacked away at this big rock, but he didn't find any silver or anything else of note. And so, around 11 a.m., Stefan was hungry and tired, and so he put his pickaxe down, he took his goggles off, he took his gloves off, and he sat down on this rock facing the lake to have some lunch. And as he sat there enjoying his food, all he could hear in the distance were the sound of a few geese down on the lake making some noise, but other than that, it was totally quiet. After he was done eating, he put his gear back on and got back to work. About an hour later, at around 12:15 p.m., Stefan was still hacking away at the rock when, despite all the noise he was making as he smashed the ground with his pickaxe, he could hear a really loud commotion coming from behind him. And it turned out when he stopped the pickaxe, the commotion sounded like geese honking and going wild. And so he dropped his pickaxe, he took his goggles, put them up on his forehead, and then he stood up and he turned around and he looked down towards the lake where he heard all these geese going crazy. And the first thing he noticed was there were some geese on the lake that appeared to be flying off in different directions like they had been startled. But what really immediately caught his attention was not the geese, but what had very likely startled the geese. And that was 2 bright, glowing red objects that were flying slowly across the lake towards him, kind of roughly over where the geese were. And now these objects, they were cylindrical. They appeared to be about maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. They didn't have any sort of emission coming off of them. They weren't making any noise. They were just kind of slowly making their way over towards where Stefan was. Now, as Stefan is watching this happen, he wasn't fearful. He assumed those have to be military aircraft. As it was, this part of Canada, Falcon Lake, is very remote. There's not many people around. And so, logically, it made sense that perhaps there's a military that's doing training exercises in this area. And so, feeling much more intrigued than fearful, Stefan just continued to watch as these red aircraft got closer and closer to his side of the lake. And then when these 2 craft were about 200 feet away from where Stefan was standing, they came to a stop. And they were just hovering in the air, and then one of the craft suddenly turned orange and began going up into the clouds, and then at some point just vanished. And then the other craft, instead of going up, just continued descending very slowly, now very clearly towards this open rock face that Stefan was standing on. Now, again, Stefan was totally convinced that these were military aircraft, conducting some sort of exercise, and so he's not fearful. He is just intrigued by what he's seeing. And in fact, by this point, he had convinced himself that this second aircraft that was now coming down to land on these rocks must have experienced some sort of issue, and they were landing in order to fix it. And Stefan even thought to himself, well, hey, I'm a mechanic. Maybe I can help the pilot or pilots with whatever's going on with their craft. Once the craft finally did touch down on the rocks about 150 feet away from Stefan, it changed colors from red to stainless steel with an orange glow around the outside of the aircraft, and inside of this craft, a really bright purple light came on that Stefan was only aware of because there was a couple of small holes on the outside of this craft where this purple light was coming through. But these little rays of purple light coming out of this craft were so bright that it actually was hard for Stefan to look directly at the craft. And so his welding goggles were still on his forehead, so he pulled them down, put them over his eyes, and his welding goggles had a kind of tint to them, so it was like he was looking through sunglasses, and with those on, he was able to continue looking at the craft. And so through his goggles, Stefan is still just standing in the same spot where he first saw these craft, and he's watching this craft that's now landed 150 feet away from him, and he's fully expecting any minute for the pilot or pilots to come out of the craft and explain what's going on. But at first, nothing happens. And so Stefan is just standing there waiting for something to happen when he realizes he has his sketchbook in his pocket. Stefan liked to bring his sketchbook along on his prospecting trips because he liked to sketch things. And so he figured while he waited for the pilot or pilots to emerge, he would sketch the craft. And so for the next couple of minutes, that's what he did. And then after he was done sketching it, he put his sketchbook away, and then really nothing happened for about another 30 minutes. He just stood there and the craft remained motionless. But after about 30 minutes of the craft having landed, it opened. There was like a sliding door on the side of the craft facing Stefan, and it revealed the beautiful, bright purple interior of this craft. But from Stefan's perspective, because of how bright the lights were and how far away he was, he couldn't tell what was inside of the craft. But Stefan's thinking, okay, clearly now the pilot or pilots are coming outside. And so Stefan felt really relieved, and he was just standing there waiting to talk to whoever was inside. But again, nothing happened. And so now, feeling just plain curious, Stefan decided, you know what, I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to yell into this open door to the pilot or pilots inside and make sure they're okay. And so he starts slowly making his way across the rock face towards this craft and this open door. And when he gets about 60 feet away from the craft, he suddenly stops because now he can hear from inside of this craft the sound of two voices talking to each other. He can't really tell what they're saying, but very clearly there is communication happening inside of this craft. And so Stefan assumed that must be the pilots, and so he called out to them in English. And the second Stefan yelled out to this craft, the voices immediately came to a stop, and they did not respond to Stefan. And so Stefan is calling out to them in English, hey, are you okay? What are you doing in there? And when English didn't work, Stefan called out in Russian. He called out in German, Italian, French, Ukrainian. And when all of those didn't work, he went back to English and just continued kind of calling out, trying to get them to please come out and talk to him. But he got no response and no one came out of the craft. And so at this point, Stefan thought, okay, I'm totally committed, so I need to keep going and make sure the pilot or pilots are okay. And so he continued walking closer and closer to this open door of the craft. And when he got about 10 feet away, he was suddenly struck by the incredible craftsmanship of this craft. He couldn't see any rivets anywhere on this amazing piece of machinery, meaning this craft appeared like it had somehow been carved out of one enormous piece of steel, which seemed totally impossible. Also, Stefan noticed there were no insignia on the outside of this craft. There was no flag or anything kind of denoting who was flying it. There was really nothing on the outside of the craft. But Stefan just kept on going until he was standing right outside of this open door. He's only a couple feet away from it, and now he's looking directly inside, and he doesn't see the pilot or pilots. And in fact, because of how bright this purple light is coming out, even with his goggles, it's really hard to see what's inside of this craft. But he can clearly see inside there is some sort of panel in the back of the craft with lots of flashing lights, almost like a computer, and there were other kind of columns of light moving around inside the craft at different angles. But after looking in this craft for only a few seconds, the door suddenly slid shut. And then Stefan, without really thinking about it, reached out and touched the craft. And the second he did that, two things happened. One, the hand that he touched the craft with, he was wearing a big welding glove, and the second he made contact with that craft, the leather glove began to melt. Not even catch on fire, it just instantly began to melt. And so he began frantically ripping the glove off to get it off of him to avoid injury. And then the second thing that happened is the craft began rotating counterclockwise until this vent that was on the outside of the craft, one of the very few things that was on the outside of the craft that actually Stefan had noted in his sketch. He had drawn this grate that sat on the outside of the craft. This grate rotated around until it was aimed directly at Stefan. Now, to picture this grate, picture like a vent you would see inside of a building where air conditioning blows air out of, right? It's kind of like that same size, the size of a license plate on a car. And instead of there being vertical slats along the vent, like you would see with an air conditioning vent cover, on this vent, on this craft, it was like a checkerboard pattern with little buttonholes all over this vent. And so Stefan is looking at this vent, and then suddenly something shoots through the vent, like an explosion that hits him square in the chest and lights him on fire. His shirt is literally in flames, and so Stefan is frantically trying to rip off his shirt. He throws it on the ground, he's stomping the flame, and as he's doing that, he looks up and sees this craft has somehow immediately shot into the sky and is now disappearing into the clouds. Now, Stefan had no idea what just happened. All he knew is his chest and his stomach now hurt tremendously. But before he could deal with that, he developed this unbelievable headache. He suddenly felt so nauseous, and he felt delirious, like he was drunk. Trying not to panic, Stefan, who now is shirtless and badly burned, he ran over and grabbed some of his things, and then he began heading back into the woods to make his way back towards the motel. It would take him several hours of stumbling through the forest, stopping periodically to vomit, but he would eventually reach the highway, he would cross over, and he would make his way into the motel right around 4 p.m. And when he got there, he made his way into the cafe, and he asked the staff if they knew where the nearest doctor was. These staff members would later tell investigators that when Stefan came tumbling into the cafe without his shirt on, looking totally horrible, they assumed he was drunk. But after talking to him, he didn't smell at all like alcohol. Instead, he reeked of this horrible sulfur smell. The staff would tell Stefan that the nearest doctor was 45 miles away. And so at this point, Stefan decided his best bet was actually to just get on a bus and go back to Winnipeg, where his family could take him to the nearest hospital. And so somehow, Stefan managed to make his way to the bus stop. He hopped on a Greyhound bus, he went to Winnipeg, and then his oldest son, Mark, met him at the bus stop and practically carried him into the hospital. The very strange checkerboard burn pattern found on Stefan's abdomen, where he claims this craft turned its vent and fired on him, were determined not to be thermal burns, meaning he didn't get them from something hot touching his skin, like everyone initially suspected. Instead, they were determined to be chemical burns, but literally no one, doctors, scientists, government agencies, no one could figure out what chemical actually burned his skin. In fact, no one was ever able to actually identify what was causing all of these ailments that Stefan was complaining of, from the headache to the nausea to the weakness to these burns, and he was tested for basically everything, from radiation poisoning to very common ailments and illnesses, and everything came back negative. Experts would go out to Falcon Lake, to the area that Stefan described seeing this craft, and sure enough, they would find an open rock face, and right around the area that Stefan described was this circular burn pattern, as if something had been perched right there that shot some sort of exhaust into the ground, and the area around this landing site was determined to be highly radioactive. Although it is assumed that the reason that area is radioactive is because there is a vein of radium that runs underneath the rocks near the area. However, what no one could explain away were the 3 identical pieces of what looked like metal, which actually turned out to be a very rare type of silver, that were located near this burn circle. Now, even though the Falcon Lake area was known apparently for having silver deposits up in the hillsides, this silver, these 3 pieces of silver, were not from the hillsides of Falcon Lake. This silver was heavily manufactured. Someone, something, some machine had manipulated the metal to bend and be cut in a very particular way. And all three of these pieces of very rare silver were highly radioactive. They would also find traces of this very rare type of silver that seemed to have seeped into some of the loose rocks that were inside of that burned out circle, almost like the silver had melted into the rock. But despite these pieces of evidence that do seem to suggest that Stefan really did see some craft land on these rocks, and despite the fact that the US government and the Canadian government both thoroughly investigated this case and they were not able to debunk it, they basically said, well, something happened, but we don't know what. Despite all of that, Stefan and his family's lives were forever upended after this incident. Stefan was ridiculed and accused of lying and of being crazy, and his kids were unfortunately bullied at school. Shortly before Stefan died in 1999 at the age of 83, he was asked if he regretted coming forward with this story. And he would say, yes, I wish I never told anyone. But he would also say, at the time, he really felt like he had a duty to tell the world about what happened. Stefan never changed his story, and he never came out and said, I think this craft came from another world, another planet, another universe. He just said, look, I think it was an experimental aircraft. That's it. He also never made a dime on this experience. If anything, he lost money because he paid to write a 40-page pamphlet that explained what happened to him, and then he left all these copies on his porch. So if news people showed up or if nosy neighbors showed up and had questions, he would just point to the stack of the books and say, take one and read it.